Okay, so let's say the three homages. Homage to the Buddha, homage to the Dharma, homage to the Sangha. So the first class we had, this is a series on the precepts. And the first class we had, Reverend Ando talked about the three treasures or the three refuges. And then the second class we had, Reverend Oswin talked about the three pure precepts. So for this class, I'm going to talk about the Shushogi by Dogen, plus I'm going to give examples from the 10 grave precepts if we have time. But my main focus is going to be the Shushogi, which you all have. I think Reverend Ando sent you a link to it. It's in Zen is Eternal Life. So I'm going to start out by reading Dogen because he's just wonderful to read. And he's the Shushogi. If you don't know, the Shushogi was lines that were put together from the Shobo Genzo, which is his big work. It's called the Eye and Treasury of the Teaching. And so what someone did is they pulled lines from this volume, which is in our monastery, in our translation, the volume is 2 volumes. So it's quite a big book. So Reverend Master Ji did this translation. It's in Zen is Eternal Life. And Shushogi is called What is Truly Meant by Training and Enlightenment. So he says, Introduction, the reason for training. The most important question for all Buddhists is how to understand birth and death completely, for then, should you be able to find the Buddha within birth and death, they both vanish. All you have to do is realize that birth and death, as such, should not be avoided, and they will cease to exist. For then, if you can understand that birth and death are nirvana itself, there is not only no necessity to avoid them, but also nothing to search for that is called nirvana. The understanding above breaks the chains that bind one to birth and death. Therefore, this problem, which is the greatest in all Buddhism, must be completely understood. Well, it may take you a life or two to understand that paragraph. So don't worry, okay? It's quite profound. And why am I bringing that up? Why do we have a recommendation that you read the Shushogi when we're about to talk about precepts? And hopefully, by the things I say for this class, you'll get a sense of it. Somehow, when we come to training, the Buddhist practice draws us into looking at our life. We can't help it. I mean, you sit down and you start looking at a wall, and all of a sudden you're in it. You can't get away from you, who you are. And that's something that we get drawn into life about. It could be as open as just a general curiosity. Well, what's life about? Why am I here? What's the meaning of it? Why are people I like sitting in front of a wall? Or I have heard that meditation might help. What does it mean? We could come to Buddhist practice because we have a disquiet, a sense of dissatisfactoriness about life. Or it could be a deep suffering and a call for help in how to deal with it. In all their own way, all of these things relate to the question about life and death. How do I live my life? What choices are good for me? How can I be happy? Why do some beings, friends, die young, etc.? All those unanswered questions that we have. So Dogen, in beginning this Shushogi, is calling our attention to these questions because, in part, they weren't separate from his own existence. If those of you who have recited evening service, which we do at the monastery, the first big line in evening service is, why are training and enlightenment differentiated since the truth is universal? And this was Dogen's spiritual koan, so to speak. This is why he came to training. And he came to training, he became a monk at a very early age. I think he was 12 or 13, 14, something like that. And he came to training in part because his father was assassinated when he was 2 years old, and his mother died when he was 8. And that had profound impact upon him, as you can, of course, imagine. I would say by 8 years old, Dogen was well aware of the fundamental Buddhist teaching about impermanence being one of the marks of human existence. One of the signs of being a human being is that we're all subject to impermanence. Many of us can and do avoid that very realization as much as we can, but eventually, somehow, we start to get it, that we can't get away from it. I had been meditating for a while, but what drew me to the practice at the Abbey big time was that my first daughter died at birth. And that was like having the rug pulled out from under my feet, and it got my attention. So what does all this have to do with precepts or moral guides, values for living? What does it have to do with trying to do no harm and trying to do good? So I'm going to try and explain that. We'll give it my best shot. The Buddha, after his enlightenment, was able to directly see others' karma, the things they did in the past that led to the suffering or the joy they were experiencing in their human life. Now, most of us, that is not easy for us to see. We cannot see our own karma clearly, let alone the karma of someone else, okay? But that's part of what happens when someone has a full enlightenment experience, is that they can sometimes have that ability to see totally into what someone was doing, had done, and where it was leading them. So the advantage of that is that he saw very clearly cause and effect, that what people did had a direct relationship into what they were experiencing in their current life, the conditions of their current life. And really, precepts are our response. They're our way to learn how to deal with the law of cause and effect. They guide us to refrain from harm. They open us to being of help to others and to be able to purify our hearts. Those are the 3 pure precepts that Reverend Oswin talked about. And that's what the precepts are fundamentally. So what I'm hoping is that you can see, and if not, you can ask questions about it, but this is the direct result of cause and effect, is that if we follow these precepts, they help us to refrain from harming. They help us to be kind to other beings, and they help us to purify our own karma. Now, we all know about people who do terrible deeds and seemingly live impervious to their actions. This happened at the time of the Buddha. This happens in our own time. I mean, we see this, and that causes us to say, well, what's going on? Maybe the law of karma isn't something, it's just some cultural misunderstanding. But actually, We have to hold in mind that we can't see the past or the future karma of beings, not very easily. So this is a really important point, because to some extent we have to take the law of karma on faith, that while I may not see it, but I'll trust that the Buddha had a very profound experience and that it was true. Additionally, those of us who have been training for a long time know, in even a short time, we start realizing that our actions have consequences. And part of meditation is seeing that. And if we're lucky, really lucky, we get the karmic consequences immediately. I think, why is Reverend Amanda saying if we're lucky? But actually it's true, because when we see what we've done, we can correct it, we can apologize, we can be polite. But if we're oblivious, or we're not seeing the consequences of our action, it just keeps going in that direction. So this is what precepts are really helpful for, because they help us start to become aware of the consequences of our actions. But anyway, we can see somebody who's done just horrible things and they're living in a lavish mansion that they bought because of their stealing or selling drugs. And yet, you know what? We have no idea what's going on in their minds. We have no idea what suffering they are experiencing in their minds, because they are getting more and more sucked into situations where they're causing more and more harm. What killing they need to do in order to maintain their terrible recklessness. This is suffering, irrespective of what their physical conditions may look like. This is intense suffering. We all know this deep down. Now, I'd like to read from Zen's Eternal Life, which is again the Shushogi. Dogen says, "None of us have more than one body during this lifetime. Therefore, it is indeed tragic to lead a life of evil as a result of heresy, for it is impossible to escape from karmic consequence. If we do evil on the assumption that, by not recognizing an act as evil, no bad karma can accrue to us." And that's a very important line, because what it really is saying is that nobody gets off. Nobody gets off the hook. If you do harm, you have the consequences of that, both to yourself and to other beings. And Dogen is saying that. You can believe it, and people do. People believe, oh, there's no consequence to what I do. Well, it doesn't matter what we believe. It does not matter. What is, and people experience it. So let's come back to meditation and see how this dovetails in. When we start to observe our own minds as we meditate, we become aware that we can spend a whole lifetime studying that. And that also makes us understand that it's impossible to know what someone else's mind is going on, what's going on in someone else's mind. We just have no idea the pain or the suffering or the joy that exists in another person's mind. It may be expressed, but we can't know what a mind's doing. As Bob Dylan sang in a song many years ago, 50 years ago, I was kind of estimating. And if you don't know who Bob Dylan is, that's fine, but he was a major phenomenon, still is. Anyway, he sang a song about, if my thoughts could be seen, they'd probably put my head in a guillotine. And I loved that song. And I used to sing it, and all of a sudden I went, oh my God, he's right. None of us, no, we don't know what's going on in our minds, but we can see how crazy our own mind is. So the precepts are for us. They're not for us to judge other people. They're not for us to say, oh, this person's doing wrong. and I'm doing the right thing, they are for us. They are to help us, to teach our own minds how to refrain from harm, how to refrain from harming ourselves, as well as doing good for ourselves and doing good for others. So they're really this gift that happens, that teaches us. The Buddha said we are owners of our own karma. And I love that, because to some extent the precepts are the recognition of our ownership of our karma. They're the bringing us home to taking responsibility. Oh, okay, yes, I've done that. Without judging ourselves, without squashing ourselves, but to be honest and just say, oh, yes, I did that. Now, the Buddha said, if you want to know what you did in the past, look at your mind in the present. I love that. And if you want to know what you're going to do in the future, look at your mind in the present. This is great as far as I'm concerned, because what he's saying is, when we start to look at our mind, we start to see the patterns, the flow of our own existence that we have inherited. And they give us the opportunity to cleanse it. And if you don't cleanse it, well, that's going to impact your future existence. And if you do cleanse it, that's going to impact your future existence. So there's some very direct, the statement, which is very profound and simple, but it's not easy to do. But still, it's very helpful. Oh, okay. Look at that. Look at how, when we try to, Reverend Master Jiyu and I talked about this in the continuing practice retreat that we did on precept. But Reverend Master Jiyu said, when she taught the monks in the beginning of how to follow one of the 10 great precepts, which was do not speak against others, that for a while at the monastery all conversation stopped. Well, it's really funny. Oh, okay, but that's us. If so much of what we can say or think is about judgment of other beings, about judgment of ourselves. And so this is really fertile ground for us to explore with ourselves. So the precepts help us distill the patterns, the habits of our mind. That's how I see them. There's this incredible distillation going on where our thoughts are going 90 miles an hour and we're just looking at it and saying, oh, isn't that interesting? Not I'm a bad person, not, oh, I shouldn't be thinking these things, nothing. Just keep coming back. Oh, this isn't who I really am. Oh, I don't have to believe this just because my mind's saying it. That's a hard one, but it's true. I don't have to believe what my mind says. Thank goodness. Precepts can also help us to focus on our intentions. I know this from personal experience, we can wish the very best for someone and it can blow up in our faces royally. So I think the precepts actually help us to sort through the messes of our lives and say, well, I had good intentions there, but it didn't work. So why didn't it work? Was there a me involved in that solution that I was so with benevolence giving to someone who they didn't want, that they didn't want? I mean, it's the precepts actually help us. This is what I mean about the distillation process. The Buddha taught that all of us, every single one, every person, has an intuitive knowledge of the Buddha nature within us. We intuitively know not to harm and even long to do good for both ourselves and others. And as we know, this is not easy to practice. When Reverend Master Jiyu was a relatively young monk, she went to visit in Malaysia. She went back to Malaysia to teach for a while for a few months as a visitor. And so she was in this university teaching to non-Buddhists, and they asked the question, well, what are the basic tenets of Buddhism? And she said, well, they're refrain from harm, do good, and do good for others. And the student said, even a child of 3 knows that. Well, they may. We all have this intuitive knowledge. But to practice it, that's where it gets difficult. And that's the whole thing. That you see all the suffering that goes on in the world. And it's primarily caused because people don't want to practice what they know. That's the irony. They get caught up in what they want rather than what they know is good to do. Because it's much harder. I understand this. It's not easy. When I was a young lay minister and I was running a part of a meditation group in Montana, we were having a meditation morning. So I went to the person's house that we were going to have the meditation morning, and I had all the supplies for the altar, and I was running around and rushing and trying to get ready. And one of the members whose house it was had set up a little altar, and they had this little Buddha and this beautiful flower and stuff. And I took the Buddha down and said, oh, here, I got this bigger Buddha, and I put it on, and I totally oblivious. I was in a hurry. And I, in all honesty, directness, yes, but obliviousness has been something I've had to really train with. So I didn't even think about it. I just changed the Buddha and went about. We had meditation Sunday, and then afterwards, somebody brought it up, and they were really mad at me. And I listened to them, and I went, oh, yeah, this is right. I really messed up here. So I turned to the person whose altar it was, and I said, I'm really sorry. That was completely oblivious. It wasn't right, and apologized. And then the person who was mad at me said, that's not enough. And so I got really still, and I sat with it, and I said, no, I think it is. It's all right, because I knew the person who I had offended, whose altar it was that I had messed with, she had accepted my apology. It was heartfelt, and we were friends. There was no obstacle. So it was very interesting for me, both that I could screw up royally, but also have the ability to sit still and say, well, actually, I did make amends, and it's okay. So, this is what life is all about. And I say that, of course it would have been better if I hadn't done that in the first place. But it was a really good lesson for me, and I was really grateful. And I was also grateful the person whose altar it was is still one of my dearest friends. So, this is how life is. We just see our mistakes. We try to be still with them. We apologize. We are contrite. And then we go on. Now, I'd like to read another paragraph from the Shushogi, because, in part, it's one of my favorite paragraphs. And because it summarizes what the precepts are. He says, within these precepts dwell the Buddhas, enfolding all things within their unparalleled wisdom. There is no distinction between subject and object for any who dwell herein. All things, earth, trees, wooden posts, bricks, stones, become Buddhas once this refuge is taken. From these precepts come forth such a wind and fire that all are driven into enlightenment when the flames are fanned by the Buddha's influence. This is the merit of non-action and non-seeking, the awakening to true wisdom. So this to me, is the summary of what the precepts really ask us. And I have to say that when I first came upon the Shasta Abbey, I read the Shushogi and the commentary on the precepts of Master Jiu's commentary. I read it every day for a while. And eventually, I don't read it every day now, but eventually the precepts become your blood and bone. They become such a part of you that to deliberately break them becomes unthinkable. You just can't do it. And it doesn't mean we don't make mistakes. And it doesn't mean that we don't. Some people who can screw up royally. But if we keep training ourselves, then they are our compassionate friends. And that I know from my personal experience. Now, I just like to start with one precept, and then I'm going to stop talking and open it up. So I don't want to talk too long. But let's just start on the first of the 10 great precepts, which is do not kill. And the original verse that used to be said is, I undertake the vow of training in order to refrain from killing. And a positive way of saying that precept is, I affirm all life, which is really nice to think about. Now, we drive cars, some of us, and those cars kill insects. So here's where, right away, is a really important thing to think about, because it is our intention not to do harm. And we go places, and harm occurs sometimes. So it's really important to look at our intention. If you've ever lived in a house or a room, and your room is invaded by ants, sometimes you have to sweep them up, or they just take over. And when you sweep them up and you put them gently in the hallway or down your stairs or whatever you do, they may or may not live. We're all doing the best we can. Tozan was walking with his master. Tozan was a Chinese ancestor in our lineage. And he is the monk who is responsible for the most excellent mirror samadhi, writing that. And plus others in literature. And Tozan was walking with his master, and they were talking, and they were walking by a river, and there was two herons, and they both went after the same frog, and they both got the frog, and neither one of them was letting go, so they were pulling the frog apart. And Tozan went, oh my. He said to his master, why does it come to this? And his master said, for your benefit. Now, I have sat with that for a long time. How is the suffering we see in life for our benefit? And I think we all have to find our way of coming to understand what that master was talking about. But the longer I train, the more I understand that when I'm willing to look at the painful suffering of life and see things that are very difficult for other beings, and that I can feel compassion and deep sympathy with them, then this karma is for my benefit too, because I get to offer that merit, that compassion. And as we all know, if you look at the news, sometimes it's overwhelming, sometimes the suffering that we see on that. And if we see it as an opportunity to not turn away, but to offer merit for beings, then, hang on, somebody that needs to come in. Thank you. Then we can see the benefit that comes. And I remember once when I was a young monk, we have an opportunity to go up and ask spiritual direction of the main monk or abbot or abbess, depending on who it is, and I went up and I said, I think karma is compassion. And that was really important to start to see. Karma is compassion. It's not punishment. It's not this pushing away. It's actually a compassionate way to help us open ourselves to our own suffering and to the suffering of others. So, in the commentary, Reverend Master and Dogen, she's commenting on Dogen's commentary, and he said, no life can be cut off, for the life of Buddha is increasing. Continue the life of Buddha and do not kill Buddha. And then Reverend Master Jiu says, above all, do not turn your face away from Buddha, the Lord of the house, for this is to commit spiritual suicide. To kill Buddha is to turn away from Buddha. Dogen says, man stands in his own shadow and wonders why it is dark, and only he can turn around. And Reverend Master Jiu says, to turn away from Buddha is to say, my ego is greater than the Lord of the house. My opinions are more right. My wishes are more important. It is you whom you kill. If you do not listen to the Lord of the house in this life, in what life will you listen to the Lord of the house? Will you for eternity attempt to commit real suicide? If you always face the Buddha, you will always know the Buddha. If you always listen to the Lord of the house, there is no possibility of your ever killing anything. I think this commentary is the most profound response to a very simple, direct, seemingly, well, don't kill precept. But actually, there's something really profound in terms of our own training. How do we go deep with this? How do we open ourselves to our hearts, to be listening to our own heart, and to recognize our willfulness when we don't want to listen to our hearts? So I think this is really this is a really good opportunity. This is where the precepts go at their very deepest.